As long as man has looked at the sky and has observed the flight of birds, he has wanted to fly. From the legend of Icarus to the designs of Leonardo da Vinci to Otto von Lilienthal, and finally to the Wright brothers. When Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, he became every young boy's idol. To fly was no longer an impossible dream, it became a challenge. And so it was for my father. His story took me on a journey into the romantic early world of aviation. Small, open biplanes with handsome and daring men, their scarves fluttering in the wind. Beautiful ladies with elegant hats. It created a society of its own. The story begins with a young boy by the name of Julijonas Kumpikevičius, born on April 29, 1910, in a small town in northern Lithuania. This town, called Mažeikiai, was inhabited by a very old race of people, the Žemaičiai, or Samogitians. These people were known throughout the centuries as being fearless. It is said they even stopped the Mongol descendants of Genghis Khan. My father's family was an old family of landed nobles and had its own crest. At the time, their home was a modest one-story house near the railroad station. My grandfather made his living from a windmill on his property.
Davė visą mechaninę energiją šitai tam cechui.
Jo, ten atsimenu, buvo tekinėm staklis toks ir buvo, aš arčiau lubų sukuosi, ten buvo visokie ir tie ratai tokie padaryti.
Antračiai buvo
Jo.
Ir ten buvo, tos audeklus reikalinga buvo suvelti.
Jo.
Ir suspausti, ir tie audeklai pasidarydavo tokie kaip pirktiniai, daug nesiskyrė. O
Labai
čia
gražiai.
atveždavo, audėjas išaudas, tik tai buvo pusfabrikačiai.
Kaip jau
Gražiai
galėjai.
nudažydavo.
Many years later, on a very windy day, the windmill toppled over and he fell to his death. When Julius, as my father was called, was about 16, my grandfather bought him an old Ford, which he dismantled and put back together again, starting his long passion for motors, mechanics, and of course, planes.
O čia viena iš pirmųjų kaimynų buvo mano senelis, kuris taip pat pasistatė šitą namą ir dar paskui toliau šitas namas, kur geltonas yra. Ten Julius ir mano tėvelis kūrė ir gamino Lietuvoje pirmąjį sklandytuvą. O jis buvo išbandytas Nidoje. Nuo kalnų buvo paleistas jūros link ir pasisekė labai gerai.
When Julius was 18, he went to the capital, Kaunas. Kaunas was not the original capital of Lithuania. Vilnius, the real capital, had been taken over by the Poles in 1920. But in 1928, Kaunas was a bustling city. Many fine homes, the presidential palace, the opera house, and most important, an airport. My father enlisted in the army, dreaming of becoming a pilot, but instead was placed in the mechanics corps of the aviation section, where he rose to the rank of sergeant and became an excellent mechanic. At the end of his military enlistment, when he was 20, he obtained a position in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a driver for the minister Dovas Zaunius. At the same time, he eagerly went to the Lithuanian Aero Club to join and learn to fly. But the president of the club, Professor Žemaitis, turned down his application stating that he did not have sufficient funds or the required credentials. At this point, my father knew that he had no chance of learning to fly in Lithuania. As he performed his duties in the ministry, he told the minister of his desire to fly and asked to be transferred to Czechoslovakia, to Prague, where aviation clubs were springing up rapidly. The minister saw the potential in this handsome, clean-cut, and friendly young man who had a passion for planes and said he had no objections to the transfer. And so, in March of 1932, my father arrived in Prague. Beautiful Prague, called Die Goldene Stadt, the Golden City by the Germans. At that time, a Lithuanian aviation section had been established in Prague. The Czech Aero Club, VS, not only had no objections to the Lithuanian section, but they also allowed students to fly for free. They were even planning to give them their own plane. My father joined immediately, and at the first meeting was elected secretary-treasurer. My father's dream was becoming a reality. He was going to fly. My father's secretarial duties were not very difficult. He began to study the Czech language and within 1 year learned it well. He also established contacts with Czech civilian and military pilots.
Bičiuliai iš Niujorko ir kitų rytinės pakrantės miestų susirinko palinkėti Dariui ir Girėnui sėkmės Niujorko Beneto aerodrome.
In the meantime, in July 1933, 2 American-Lithuanian pilots, Darius and Girenas, were preparing to cross the Atlantic from New York. They took off from Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn. The people of Lithuania followed the news with excitement.
M. Liepos 17, 0:30. 2 lietuviai lakūnai Darius ir Girėnas susimušė Vokietijoje. Katastrofos priežastys nežinomos.
For my father, as for the entire country, it was a national tragedy. My father wrote in his memoirs,
In August 1933, a Czech captain befriended me and began to give me lessons personally. The best conditions were afforded at the Masarykova Letecka Liga. Finally, I began to fly. All was going well. I made about 12 flights with an instructor, a total of about 5 hours flight time, and I began to fly out alone. Winter came, all flights were suspended. I took advantage of the bad weather and studied the Czech and international air regulations. On January 21, 1934, I arrived at Kabeli Airport to make my test flight. I completed all the required maneuvers and passed the first part of the exam very well. 2 days later, I took the written exam in Czech and passed it also. I now had my Czech civilian pilot certification, the first foreigner to have achieved this. My license was barely warm in my pocket when I received news from the Lithuanian Aero Club urging me to fly home to Lithuania. I hesitated. I had no compass, no maps, and no parachute. The Aero Club would eagerly supply them. They would even send me a flying suit. So, all that was left to obtain was the compass and an auxiliary gas tank and, Of course, a plane. There was an old trainer plane at the airport which was not being used because it needed repairs. I approached the League and asked to buy the plane. The League said that they could not sell me the plane even though no one wanted to fly with it and it was just taking up space. But if I made a donation of 1,000 korunas, the plane would be mine to do with as I wished. And so, I became the owner of my own plane. The plane was a Czech Letov S-18 single-engine two-seat biplane, designed by Alois Šmolik at Letov Kabeli in 1925 and used as a trainer by the Czechoslovakian Air Force. It was equipped with a Walter NZ60 horsepower engine with the registration OK-LIS. The repairs of the plane took me several weeks. I had to install an auxiliary gas tank, a pump to maintain pressure. I adjusted the compass, and on March 5th, at noon, I took off from Kabeli Airport in Prague. The destination, Kaunas via Berlin. As I approached the Bohemian mountain range, I flew into a severe storm. I started to circle to gain altitude, but the Šmolik was not responding. Then I saw a river course, began to follow it, and slipped through the mountains. I reached Germany. Having escaped the storm area near Dresden, I flew into dense fog. I was flying very low. Seeing a lighter area towards the north, I flew in that direction. The fog was still very dense. I turned further north. A headwind was impeding me and there was still fog. Suddenly, the engine was starting to cut out. I began to pump the auxiliary gas tank. The engine stabilized. I flew on and was climbing higher to reach 700 meters so that, in case of emergency, I could choose a landing spot to set the plane down. Then the propeller stopped. I had to glide. I began circling and descending. Some wide fields and a large estate nearby appeared below, and I set the plane down successfully. Almost immediately, some security officers drove up, and I was arrested as a spy. I was interrogated and asked if I had a camera and a revolver. It seemed I had landed in Konigsberg, Neumark, at the estate of Baron von Neumann. After calling Berlin, where I was destined to land, it was verified that I was not a spy. A mechanic even took me back to my plane to determine the cause of the problem. Apparently, the top fuel tanks had failed to feed the engine, and the auxiliary tank was half empty. It was too dark to fly, so I was invited to dine with the Baron and spend the night. It was not a simple dinner, but rather a true celebration. About 30 high-ranking officers were present. Very soon, the singing began. All the songs were war songs. My host and his guest were in high spirits and asked me to join them, but I remained quite sober and only participated politely. The next morning, March 6th, having obtained fuel, I thanked von Neumann for his hospitality, circled the estate a few times as I had been asked to do, and took off for Stolp. Von Neumann advised me not to fly to Berlin, but rather to Stargard, where there was an airport. About 25 kilometers past Stettin, I again had problems with the fuel system delivery. As I approached the Stargard airport, I encountered a strong wind. It was impossible to land. I turned south and landed about 3 kilometers from Stargard in the fields once again. I saw about 100 men doing maneuvers. It appeared to be a German youth training camp. I was almost arrested until the police arrived and verified that I had just left the von Neumann estate. They advised me to return to Stettin to check out the engine. At the airport, I found a very good mechanic who replaced all the rubber fuel joints and some other fuel connections. Once again, it was too late to fly, and I had to overnight near Stettin. The next day, March 7th, I arrived at the airport, but the headwind was very strong and the forecast bad. It was raining between Stolp and Danzig, and the winds were strong. The planes of the joint German-Russian company Deroluft were not flying due to bad weather conditions. After waiting a few hours, I decided to fly anyway. As I reached about 150 meters above ground, I picked up a good tailwind. The Smolik was flying beautifully. The rotations were fine, although the plane was being tossed about. On the way, I encountered small clouds and a light rain. Having landed at Stolp, I refueled and continued on towards Konigsberg. The weather was the same, substantial rain, but the wind had subsided. It was getting dark. Below, nothing but puddles and trees, a breeding ground for moose. In the distance, I saw a KL-35 doing loops. When I landed in Danzig, it was almost dark. Having checked the engine and refueled, I went to town to spend the night. The third day, March 8th, I took off for the last leg of the journey to Konigsberg. I followed the river course. The view was splendid. Areas of water, and below, a cement breakwater. I reached Konigsberg at about 12 p.m. Having received a light signal to land, I descended. When I climbed out of the plane, I was very surprised to see General Consul Jonas Budrys with his wife and son who had come to greet me. While I was refueling, the Consul General told me the weather prognosis was not good. Nonetheless, I decided to continue on to Lithuania, whose border was not far. Barely 10 minutes out of Konigsberg, I saw I was flying into dark clouds. Should I turn back or press on? I saw a clearer sky to the left and turned towards it. The weather cleared up. I adjusted the compass toward Kaunas once again. Flying towards Smolenininkai, I saw the Lithuanian flag on the customs building. The beautiful Nemunas River was beneath me, and I decided to follow the river course, so that in case of another emergency, I could set the plane down on its sandy shore. Outside of Kaunas, it became very windy. All of a sudden, a strong wind flipped my plane over. I was in a death loop. I struggled several times to right myself with no success. My altitude was dropping. I had dropped to 80 meters and was still not able to right myself. I saw the land quickly approaching below me. Finally, on the third try, I was able to right my plane. I had made a triangular detour and missed the welcoming plane, which the Aero Club had sent to greet me. I saw a large crowd of people. I could not believe that so many people had come to welcome me. Having landed and shut down the engine, I climbed out of the plane and was surrounded by people. Among them, the president of the Aero Club, Professor Žemaitis, and many of the officers and pilots of the Air Force. Rooms had been arranged for me at the famous Metropolis Hotel in Kaunas, and a formal dinner would be given that evening in my honor. At the dinner, Professor Žemaitis congratulated me warmly and recounted my hazardous flight. I was awarded the title of First Lithuanian International Civilian Pilot and received the sum of 1,000 litas.
During the years before the war, my father worked to establish a National Guard aviation section in Kaunas, and with the help of his many acrobatic flights to raise money and his speeches on the radio, the section was formed. In 1936, he met a young woman from Marijampolė who was a French teacher, Izabelė Aviženytė. They were introduced by a mutual friend, Vincas Abraitis. My mother had called him to invite him to a party. He asked if he could bring a friend, and that friend was my father. My mother later told me that it had been love at first sight, and if he had asked her to marry him that first day, she would have accepted. They married on what later became a very historic day, August 23, 1939. It was the day that Ribbentrop and Molotov signed the pact that divided Europe into spheres of influence. A week later, the war broke out, and their world turned upside down. The Russians invaded Lithuania and returned its capital Vilnius to Lithuania.
Rusų karininkai praneša, kad mūsų kariuomenė jau gali pradėti žygį į Vilnių. Perpjaunama užtvara ir kariuomenės vadas kariuomeniai įsako žygiuoti į Vilnių.
My father was appointed transportation director for the entire Vilnius region. It was a responsible position and a dangerous one. Although not a political man, he had to maneuver between the Soviets and his responsibilities to his family, his employees, and his country. Slogans, demonstrations by communist supporters were frequent and massive. Young men were urged to vote for the Lithuanian Workers' Union in Parliament, which was really the Communist Party. Equal rights and responsibilities for women were being promulgated. In 1941, the Russians began massive deportations of Lithuanians. People were loaded onto cattle cars and were transported to the desolate regions of Siberia. During the winter, my father continued working. He had his own driver and oversaw his men. I was born and experienced my first snow with my grandmother.
Vor Wilna. Die Sowjets mussten Hals über Kopf die Stadt räumen.
When the Germans occupied Lithuania in the summer of 1941, my father retained his position as Director of Transportation and shortened his name to Kumpikas. Once again, it was a perilous position. He now had to deal with the German commanders in an increasingly more dangerous city, which was subjected to sporadic bombing. We remained in our apartment in Vilnius, but at one point during the war, my father moved us outside of Vilnius for safety reasons, to a suburb called Jeruzalimka. And then, in 1944, with the second coming of the communists, my father felt that the Russians would stay for a long time. So my parents packed their life into 2 suitcases and left. We crossed the border into Germany with thousands of other refugees fleeing from the imminent communist oppression. We were fortunate that the Germans were allowing refugees to enter, even though Germany was under attack. My parents went to the north, to the province of Schleswig-Holstein, a town called Neumünster. It was near the port town of Kiel. We rented a room in a small house. My father began working for the Red Cross, making deliveries of Red Cross supplies. There was a great shortage of food, but the Germans gave all the refugees ration coupons, so although hungry, we did not starve. The Americans and English bombed the region almost daily. We would hear a warning siren and then would have 15 minutes to either leave town or seek shelter. For a child, the sound of a falling bomb is unforgettable. The war ended in 1945. It was summer. Life became more normal and was no longer filled with fear. A German lady offered to sell her car to my father. She said that the English would confiscate it anyway. It was a DKW, a type of small truck. Germany was divided into 4 zones by the Allies. Neumünster was in the English zone. We drove south, leaving the English zone, and entered the French zone. My father's sister and her family were living in Tübingen. Tübingen was a beautiful old university town. We lived in an apartment overlooking the Neckar River. My father continued working for the Red Cross and even had the use of a second car. In contrast to most refugees, we never lived in displaced person or DP camps. I began to go to school. It was a Lithuanian school, not a German one, because the Allies allowed people to choose the school their children attended. After a year or so, the French commandant ordered a certain amount of Lithuanian families to move out of Tübingen. So we moved to a small town nearby, Meringen. We rented an apartment in a house owned by the Steinmeier family. Those were happy days for me. I had many friends and played in the fields with the German children. Sometimes we went to visit a DP camp in Hanau where my cousins lived. On weekends, my father would take us out of the city to the banks of the Neckar River. He would invite French officers to come along, and we would all go fishing. And at the age of 7, I caught my first fish. After Meiringen in 1948, we moved to Reutlingen, and my father was still working for the Red Cross. In addition, my mother was recommended by the French military government for a teaching position to teach French at one of the DP camps. She earned about 226 Deutschmark every month. In 1949, after 5 years in Germany, the United States began to accept displaced persons. We received an affidavit of support, which was furnished for us by my aunt and uncle, who had already left for the United States in 1947. We traveled by train to an embarkation center in Bremen to be processed. We spent about a week at Camp Groen, living in the barracks. And in the first days of July 1949, we sailed from Bremerhaven on the General Sturgis. On the ship, my father was designated as an MP or military police for the refugees. Not that there was any need for it, because we were not in any way troublesome people. The young people even performed folk songs for the ship's captain and gave him gifts of folk art. Although there was great excitement and anticipation, there was sadness as well. People knew they were leaving Europe, their home, and would probably never return. But children are such that they tend not to look back, but only forward. The voyage was beautiful until towards the 6th day, we ran into the aftermath of a storm and experienced some rough seas. Many people and children were seasick, but I was not. Finally, on the morning of the 7th day, we saw land. Boston Harbor appeared in the early morning sunlight. Who can describe the feeling of first seeing the coast of the United States, the country of dreams, the country of possibilities and potential? We were given $10 per person by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or as we called it, UNRWA. The first thing my father bought was some oranges for my mother and me. We took the train from South Station to New York. My uncle and cousin met us at Grand Central Station, and then we took the subway to Brooklyn. As we walked up the street that first day in America, toward the apartment that my aunt and uncle had rented for us, I remember looking at the sidewalks and thinking, why are they not made of gold? Our first apartment on Wythe Avenue in Williamsburg. It was small, and I slept on a couch. There was no bath, so we went to the public baths nearby. The summer was hot, unbearably so for people not used to it. Children would cool off by open fire hydrants. My mother would not let me go across the street to the playground where there was a sprinkler, because she was afraid of polio, which was rampant. So the only respite from the heat was to walk down to the East River for a breath of cool air, where boys would jump off the pier in the evening. My father did not speak English and could not find a job. He was told to come back when he had American experience. So my father was ready to take almost any type of work. First he was offered a job in an asbestos factory, but my mother refused to let him take it. Then he was offered a job as a window washer on skyscrapers, but my mother was petrified that he would fall and be killed. Finally, someone suggested he go to a Lithuanian bar to see if he could make a connection. A Lithuanian who owned a tailor shop, Rauba, offered him a job as a clothes presser. He earned some money, and soon after he was able to buy his first American car, a 1937 Ford. And so, we were the first in our group to own a car. We were invited to our first picnic that summer. Most of the people were immigrants who had come at the turn of the century. Hard-working and hard-drinking men who had worked in various trades and had reached a certain security. Although he was young and strong, my father would come home from his job as a presser, pale and exhausted. His leg and arm would be trembling. My mother became concerned and told him to quit. In order to make a living, my father obtained some space on the ground floor of the United Lithuanian Relief Fund of America, a charitable organization on Grant Street, and opened a motor repair shop. We were invited to our first Thanksgiving dinner. I had never seen a turkey before. It was so big and beautiful. On Saturdays, we would go to the movies. My father and I both liked westerns. We celebrated our first Christmas. We saw the dazzling lights of Manhattan and its magical Christmas season. My father bought our first Christmas tree and a box of American Christmas ornaments. And then came Easter. Sunday Mass at Annunciation Church in Williamsburg became a tradition. I made my first communion. We stayed in Williamsburg for about 9 months. Then, in 1950, we moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant to a better apartment with a real bathtub. The apartment and house were beautiful and close to Manhattan. Unfortunately, there was not enough work for my father at the shop to support his family. He even attempted a business partnership with an American businessman to make metal ferrules used on the ends of furniture legs. But he was not able to fill the orders quickly enough, and the business failed. Then he got a job in an aeronautics firm as a machinist working nights. After sleeping only a few hours, he'd go to his shop and repair motors. So, for a few years, he worked 2 jobs. The job at the aeronautics firm was hard. The men did not wear protective gloves, and every morning he'd come home with the metal chips in his hands, which my mother had to dig out. He was earning 45 cents an hour. In the spring and early fall, we would go to Prospect Park in Brooklyn. my father bought a second car, a Chevrolet. People began to form social groups, and I began to go to dances. We learned English and became American citizens. Finally, my father gave up his shop and remained with the manufacturing firm working nights. My father needed to get away from his job and relax with his second passion, fishing. There was a boatyard in Brooklyn near Marine Park Bridge called Martin's Boatyard, which was just across the road from Floyd Bennett Field, from which the Lithuanian flyers Darius and Girenas had taken off in 1933 on their historic transatlantic flight. Sometimes, as we passed the field, my father would talk about the two famous pilots. In the summer, on weekends, we would rent a boat. My father would row us out to a deserted beach called Plum Beach, and we'd spend the day. He taught me how to fish. Sometimes I would invite my cousin, and my parents would invite some friends to spend the day by the water, away from the sweltering summer heat of Brooklyn. A few years later, my father bought his own boat with an outboard motor. On our way back, we would drive up Bedford Avenue past Ebbets Field and hear the roar of the baseball crowd cheering the Dodgers. We saved some money, and in 1960, we moved out of Brooklyn into our own house in Queens. We had a small garden and a big German Shepherd. My father bought another car, a 1957 Chevrolet, and then another. In 1969, we moved again to Hollis Hills, another section in Queens. Life went on. I graduated from college and even earned a PhD. My father kissed my hand and cried. Finally, after 25 years with the aeronautics firm, my father retired at the age of 65. Was my father happy? I cannot say. He had lost his country and his future. He had gained a new country, but was never able to recreate his position. It was a life like many other lives, a life with moments of happiness. But always, he would recall his flight from Prague, when he was young, when no challenge was too great, and no dream impossible. And after all, what is a man without a dream?